I'm Sean Spicer, and this is an Agile IT brown bag. Now, you've seen my tech talks, and the brown bag series are generally done as internal sessions for our own employees. And this was one I did in late summer of 2020, and it's the history of cybersecurity regulations as they lead up to CMMC. Now, the reason why I didn't turn this into a tech talk is, well, first of all, there's no demo. But second of all, it's a little bit informal, a little bit quirky, and it's a really deep dive into the history of cybersecurity regulations and the reason why we wound up with the cybersecurity maturity model certification. Now, this week, Agile IT got recognized as a registered provider organization. You can't see me, but I've got my arms thrown up in the air. This has been really exciting. Myself, as well as one of our engineering managers, Pat Westcott, a couple weeks ago became registered practitioners. And after 2 years of helping companies comply with NIST 800-171, doing these GCC high migrations, and really focusing on the defense industrial base, now that this is available and now that CMMC is moving forward, it feels really good to be there, be official, and be part of the ecosystem. So let's get started. So to get started, we need to go back in time to when all these regulations started. Now, ARPANET, the precursor to the internet, officially began on October 29th, 1969, when the first computer link was made between 4 schools: UCLA, Stanford, UC Santa Barbara, and the University of Utah. That day, the first message sent across what would eventually become the internet was low. 2 letters into typing the word login, the entire system crashed, only to be brought up hours later to complete the message and kick off the information age. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, where this image comes from, had come out just 2 years earlier in 1967. And at the time, we thought the Wild West was behind us, having no clue what was ahead. But to find our oldest cybersecurity regulation, we actually have to go all the way back to 1863. The same era as when the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly took place, the real Wild West, and just 17 months after the first cross-country telegraph transmission was ever made. But the oldest cybersecurity law didn't arise from telegraph hackers. It came from horses, guns, and ammo. Now, in 1863, the United States was in the middle of the Civil War, and unscrupulous businesses were actively defrauding the government, selling uniforms that would dissolve in the rain, bad rifles and ammunition, spoiled food, and lame or sick horses and mules. In March of 1963, Congress responded by passing the False Claims Act, now frequently called the Lincoln Law, in order to recover damages from those who would attempt to defraud the government. Now, what is distinctive about the FCA is that it's the U.S.'s only qui tam law. Qui tam is short for the Latin phrase, and pardon my Latin, qui tam pro domino, rege quam pro si ipso in hac parte sequitur. Translated, that means, and the translation's a mouthful too, he who brings a case on behalf of our Lord the King as well as for himself. So the FCA allows individuals to sue on behalf of the government and receive a portion of the damages recovered. These individuals are legally called realtors, but today we know them as whistleblowers. These realtors would receive half of the damages in a winning case. These laws were common in England, but frowned upon in the US. The chief sponsor of the FCA, Michigan Senator Jacob Howard, defended this provision by saying, "I have based this upon the old-fashioned idea of holding out a temptation and setting a rogue to catch a rogue, which is the safest and most expeditious way I have ever discovered of bringing rogues to justice." Today, it still remains the US's only qui tam law. And no, it had nothing to do with cybersecurity. So let's forget about it for a minute. But trust me, it's going to matter a lot in 120 years. So moving forward, chronologically, we come to ITAR. Don't worry, we'll get to the Cyber West again in a minute. So introduced in 1976, ITAR has roots going back to the export control system that started in 1940. And it is 343 pages of absolute weaponized boredom. Literally, it's a bureaucratic hellscape. It belongs to Congress. It's primarily cared about by the State Department. But everybody can suggest changes, which then get discussed, voted on, and then discussed some more. In 2010, Secretary Robert Gates said that the system is a Byzantine amalgam of authorities, roles, and missions scattered around different parts of the federal government. ITAR sucks. If we lived in a Douglas Adams novel, the ITAR regulations would be banned for import by most of the countries on Earth for being a weapons-grade mess and weaponized bureaucracy. On the State Department page for Understanding ITAR, this is the lead text. Go ahead and read that. I'll give you a minute. What's even better is you don't even get the official version. You get the real-time version. ITAR is updated constantly, with updates tagged within the Federal Register, alongside every phrase uttered in DC. The ITAR stuff is collected and then published, get this, every April 1st in a physical book. Without that book, you don't even get to read the whole thing. It's broken up into cross-referencing sections, making reading it nearly impossible. So if you can avoid reading ITAR, do it. But anyone wanting to export any item, idea, or information to any foreign person must be concerned about the need for an export license, whether or not it's subject to export control, and even has to deal with this mess. But it is important for us for a couple of reasons. First off, it defines a U.S. person. Now, ITAR makes a distinction between a U.S. person and a non-U.S. person. We're going to get kind of deep here. So a U.S. person involves this convoluted definition that includes U.S. citizens, many people with U.S. permanent residency, and certain corporations that are predominantly located in the U.S. Yes, a U.S. person is not necessarily a person. So this is one of the things that really confuses people when they're applying for GCC High. And we've got a video that covers that on its own. Now, there are further complications involving dual nationals and third country nationals for so-called third-party transfers. The law makes a distinction among different classes of weapons, including significant military equipment, Missile Technology Control Regime Annex, and Department of Defense Military Critical Technologies List, and the Developing Science and Technologies List. Then, the 21st category in the USML, is titled Miscellaneous Articles, which includes any article not specifically enumerated in the other categories with military applicability designed for military purposes or technical data or services related to such an article. Finally, there are different categories of foreign people which need to be accounted for in terms of potential transfer. For example, a university can disclose ITAR technical data to a foreign person who is a full-time employee, like a postdoc, providing certain procedures are followed and that the employee is not from a country to which the United States observes an arms embargo, which includes China. A similar complication arises with respect to dual nationals, who are employees of an end-use company that has been approved for an export of a product or technical data. ITAR is one of the main reasons why GCC High is so important, because it assures the two things that ITAR really needs. U.S. persons only have access to the infrastructure, and the data never leaves the United States. Data sovereignty versus data residency. Again, something else I've covered in a former Tech Talk. So FAR was introduced in 1979 and was an attempt to simplify things and to be an easier, more streamlined way for the government to acquire things. Its goals were to assure competition, create common contracting method, and set out mandatory clauses that must exist in every federal contract. Ironically, the Government Accountability Office in 2006 published a 38-page highlights white paper that came to the conclusion that FAR was so complex that it limited competition for federal contracts because nobody could understand it. What's most important to us is that there are differences in the ways that various federal agencies must buy things. And so almost every cabinet level department, like the Department of Agriculture, and many agencies like the FDA, have their own supplements to the FAR. The one we're most concerned about is Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation. But we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. We'll come to that in a minute. Now we're finally at the 80s, the Wild West, also known as the Frontier Era. That period lasted from 1845 with the first utterance of Manifest Destiny and 1890 with the admission of the Western states into the Union. The Internet's Wild West could almost be bookended by the movies Wargames, released in 1983, the same year the Internet was born, and Hackers, released in 1995. To draw an interesting parallel, Sears Roebuck was founded in 1893. Pardon me. While Amazon was founded in 1994, both companies marking the end of these lawless eras. One of the biggest reasons for comparisons to the Wild West is that nobody knew who had what authority when it came to cybercrime. The Secret Service, as part of the Treasury Department, handled interstate wire fraud, while the FBI managed overall interstate law enforcement. Fights broke out among us. Now, it was not uncommon for agencies to purposely not share information. Yet, also during this time, very little was regulated regarding cybersecurity, and instead, laws were focused on figuring out what was actually illegal. Given the initial lack of laws, computer crimes were prosecuted by mail and wire fraud laws, which often didn't account for the real nuances of fighting hackers. Now, this isn't something that really affects us now or within the industry, but I'm including it to highlight the span of time between FAR in 1979 and FISMA in 2002. That was a 23-year-long gap where cybersecurity was never taken into account in federal regulations or in acquisitions, while we saw computers grow in constant importance. Think about where we were with computers in 2002. Of course, during this time, ITAR continued to grow and grow and grow, restricting everything from transistors to encryption algorithms for export. The only computers in theory covered by the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act are defined as protected computers, and they're defined under Section 18 USC 1030 E2 to mean a computer that exclusively for the use of a financial institution or the United States government or any computer when the conduct constituting the offense affects the computer's use by or for the financial institution or the government. So they're looking out for the banks and the government here. Or, this is important, which is used in or affecting interstate or foreign commerce or communication, including a computer located outside the United States that is used in a manner that affects interstate or foreign commerce or communication. In practice, when you think about that affects interstate communication, any ordinary computer has come under the jurisdiction of this law, including most of our cell phones, due to the interstate nature of most internet communications. So, a little bit of trivia. The first person federally prosecuted and jailed for felony hacking was Robert Morris, and on November 2nd, 1988, Morris ran a program he'd been working on in an attempt to measure the size of the internet. He blew it. The program was the first worm, and it was also the first fort bomb and the first denial of service attack. And talk about messing up. So now, let's take a breath. We finally find ourselves in the 21st century. FISMA, the Federal Information Security Management, is United States legislation that defines a comprehensive framework to protect government information, operations, and assets against natural or man-made threats. FISMA was signed into law as part of the Electronic Government Act of 2002 under President Bush. Now, FISMA assigns responsibilities to various agencies to ensure the security of data in the federal government. The act requires program officials and the head of each agency to conduct annual reviews of information security programs with the intent of keeping risks at or below specified acceptable levels in a cost-effective, timely, and efficient manner. This language is probably starting to look familiar for some of you. Now, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, outlined these 9 steps towards compliance with FISMA. This is also part of NIST 800-52. So next in 2005, ISO 27001 was introduced, and it's primarily used by the civilian sector and covers a lot more than just IT, but it's worth mentioning for a few reasons. First off, it has a certification body, and you can be certified as ISO 27001 compliant. Many DoD contractors saw this as a stopgap measure between NIST 800-171 and DFARS, but it's important to know that 27001 compliance does not meet NIST 800-171 by itself. So breaking it down into 3 stages. Stage 1 is a preliminary informal review of the information security management system, checking the existence and completeness of key documentation such as information security policy, statement of applicability, and risk treatment plan. When you think about this, it really comes down to what would later be known as SSPs, POAMs. Stage 2 is a detailed and formal compliance audit, testing the ISMS, the Information Security Management System, against the requirements specified in ISO 27001. The auditors will seek evidence to confirm that the management system has been properly designed and implemented, as in fact in operation. Certification audits are usually conducted by ISO 27001 lead auditors. Passing this stage results in the ISMS being certified compliant with ISO 27001. And then there is an ongoing phase, which involves follow-up reviews or audits to confirm that the organization remains in compliance with the standard. Certification maintenance requires periodic reassessment audits to confirm that the ISMS continues to operate as specified and intended. These should happen at least annually, but are often conducted more frequently, particularly while the ISMS is still maturing. And you're starting to see now with this certification body where we're getting. So remember when I said each government department has its own supplement to FARS? Well, in 2010, the DoD published theirs. This is the elephant in the room for defense contractors. Again, DFARS is not just about cybersecurity. Rather, it talks about things like labor protection, mandatory clauses in contracts, penalties, and competition. However, on December 21st, 2017, DFARS Cybersecurity Clause 252.204-7012 went into effect, requiring compliance with NIST 800-171. I know we haven't covered that yet, but it didn't even exist when DFARS was first published. Now, achieving compliance with DFARS, there are 3 ways contractors comply with DFARS. The easy way, contractors self-assess their compliance and make an attestation that they are compliant with DFARS and have implemented the NIST SP 871 security controls. The difficult and not really complete way is you hire an arbitrary third-party organization, remember there's no certifying authority, that provides external auditing on the contractor and their own certification that the contractor has met the requirements for certification. And I'm making air quotes here. And then really unattainable, except for your huge prime contractors like Raytheon and General Dynamics, a federal team can be dispatched to inspect a contractor's security planning systems. So DFARS was amended later to include CMMC. We'll get to that too. Now we come to NIST Special Publication 800-171. Behind CMMC, NIST 800-171 is probably the most important framework any defense contractor needs to understand, because when DFARS required NIST compliance in December 2017, they gave contractors 12 months to meet it, with a deadline of December 31st, 2018. This is really freaking important, and I want to highlight it. There's 2 ways that new prospects come to me to ask about GCC High. Again, I'm going to say, this is really important. So I pick up the phone and somebody says, "Hi, I'm looking for a cloud environment so I can maintain NIST 800-171 compliance." Then I pick up the phone and somebody else says, "Hi, I need GCC High so I can be NIST compliant." In the first case, the organization has probably taken formal steps towards actually meeting NIST 171. They probably have an SSP info out. They may not be 100% there. In fact, I don't know that anybody ever got 100% there. But in the second case, they have probably been signing contracts and attesting that they meet NIST 800. And now that CMMC is going to require an actual audit and submitting a self-attestation to the supplier performance risk system, they're rushing to get there. And they think GCC High is an easy way to get there. I'm not going to scream this because I'm not in a conference room. I'm not Steve Ballmer. But imagine me screaming it. GCC High is not NIST compliant. It is, however, the only environment where organizations can get to the point to meet NIST 800-171 compliance requirements and meet DFARS and meet ITAR. But an organization can be in GCC High and keep doing dumb things to not be compliant. It is not going to finish the journey for you. Okay, I'm going to take my blood pressure medication right now. So remember this guy, the Civil War horses and the False Claims Act? Well, it's still around today, but it's gotten a little bit tougher. So to flash back to the 80s, I know we're jumping around more than Marty McFly, but back in the 1980s version of the Wild West, stories became public. You guys, if you're old enough, you'll remember these, about government contractors selling the government $500 hammers and $800 toilet seats. Looking deeper into the matter, and with all the complications of TAR and FAR, it was difficult. And so Congress started strengthening the False Claims Act. This means something to us now, because that second guy who I mentioned, who's in a rush to meet NIST 800-171 and hasn't done anything since DFARS 7012, he knows the Dirty Harry's coming for him. Because all their contracts include language, those mandatory clauses set out by FAR and DFARS, that any defense contractor that submits a proposal in response to a solicitation that contains DFARS 252.204, 708, or 7012 certifies compliance with the NIST SP 800-171 standards. On July 31st, 2019, an $8.6 million False Claims Act settlement was unsealed versus Cisco Systems. From May 2011 to July 2019, this case wound its way through litigation. And it's considered highly significant because it was the first False Claims Act case that was based on failure to comply with cybersecurity regulations. Another company had an attempt to dismiss a false claims suit brought against them by their former senior director of cybersecurity. In this case, the courts refused to dismiss the case and held that the alleged misrepresentations were material because although the contractor disclosed certain areas of noncompliance, it allegedly failed to disclose the full extent of its noncompliance. The court also noted that even if the government awards a contract, knowing the contractor has areas in which it is not yet fully compliant, that doesn't mean that the contractor can rely on the government's knowledge and acceptance of partial compliance, the POAM, to then proceed with performance without ever becoming entirely compliant. Therefore, if the clauses in the contract, like all other requirements, the contractor needs to comply with it. If there are areas where contractors are still working towards compliance, those should be accurately and fully disclosed. If you have milestones in your POAM that say by a certain date you're going to have something done, you still have to do it. You can't just put out a POAM saying, oh yeah, we'll be fine by next year, and throw it under the couch. Dirty Harry's going to come for you. So I'm going to wrap this up with where we are now. And then I'm going to take a break and let my voice heal before I do yet another video. So here's where we've come from. We have the Federal Acquisitions Regulation, Clause 52-204-21, which had cybersecurity requirements for the entire federal government, 15 safeguarding requirements that were meant to protect federal contract information. Then we had DFARS, Clause 252-204-7012, which included the 110 controls in NIST 800-171, and it was focused on protecting controlled unclassified information. I'm going to bring this slide up in the next video I do as well. Now, this just wasn't working. It was self-certifying. So people were doing things like Cisco and like that other company that, pardon me, that had never acted on their POAM. So these were done with an SSP and the plan of action and milestones, or plan of action and mitigation, depending on which source you're reading from. And that leads to the False Claims Act. Now, we are rolling out with CMMC, and that was enacted on November 30th, 2020, with Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement Clause 252.204-7021, which specifies a 5-year rollout of CMMC. But it also requires that the DoD contractors submit a self-assessment against NIST 800-171 into the DoD Supplier Performance Risk System, or SPRS, in order to show where they are. And the talk around the False Claims Act has calmed down a little bit as well, because they really just want everyone to get secure. We've been handing out, giving away information to third parties, hackers, nation state actors for years, and it's time for that to stop. And finally, the other one that is still important, because notice these plus signs, these did not replace each other, they're additive. So you still have to meet DFARS 7012. But the other one that still sits there is ITAR. And that is still, if you are working with anything that's specified within the ITAR catalog of controlled export items, you still need to meet those controls. So this is a whole bunch of cybersecurity regulations. I had a lot of fun talking about the Wild West. If you're watching and you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comments section down below. Give us a like and follow. Likewise, if you're reading it on our blog, I love the comments, love to try to give answers. Stump the Chump is my favorite game, because then I get to go and ask real experts about what the real answers are, and I've got a number in my pocket. But for right now, thank you very much for joining. Hope you enjoyed this presentation, and have a great day.